The summer sky over Washington, D.C. turned an unusual shade of purple as the massive alien ship descended through the atmosphere. Its smooth silver surface reflected the sunlight, creating patterns that danced across the ground below. Military jets escorted the vessel, looking like tiny insects next to its enormous bulk. On the ground, General Tom Adams stood straight, his weathered face showing no emotion despite the historic moment unfolding before him. Beside him, Dr. Mary Wilson, Earth's chief diplomat for this encounter, smoothed her blazer for the 10th time in as many minutes. "They're actually here," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The ship settled onto the open field with surprising grace for its size. A soft hum filled the air as its engines powered down. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then, with a quiet hiss, a doorway appeared in the ship's smooth surface. 3 figures emerged. The first was tall and elegant, with silvery blue skin that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. This was Ambassador Lyra of the Stellar Confederation, as they had been informed. Behind her walked 2 guards in what appeared to be ceremonial armor. But it was the 4th figure that caught everyone's attention. Nova, the ambassador's daughter, stepped out with an air of casual boredom. Her skin was a lighter shade of blue than her mother's, and her eyes darted around the welcoming committee with barely concealed disdain. "Welcome to Earth," Dr. Wilson stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "We are honored to host representatives of the Stellar Confederation." Ambassador Lyra bowed slightly. "The honor is ours, to finally meet the species that has recently achieved faster-than-light communication." Her voice was melodious, the universal translator doing its job perfectly. Nova, however, was paying more attention to the military personnel present, her eyes fixed on their rifles, and a small laugh escaped her lips. "Mother, are those projectile weapons? They still use gunpowder." General Adams's jaw tightened, but he maintained his professional demeanor. The young alien's comment had not gone unnoticed by the soldiers either, but they remained at attention. "Nova," Ambassador Lyra's voice carried a warning tone. "We are guests here." "But Mother, look at them. Their weapons are practically antiques. Even their ships are powered by chemical rockets." Nova gestured at the fighter jets now landing nearby. "The outer colonies have more advanced toys in their museums." Dr. Wilson watched the exchange with growing concern. This was not how she had hoped the first meeting would go. The military personnel were proud professionals, and this young alien was openly mocking their capabilities. As the diplomatic party moved toward the prepared conference building, Nova continued to make observations about Earth's primitive technology. Her eyes widened with disbelief when she saw a tank in the distance, part of the base's normal security. They still use tracked vehicles, with metal armor. She couldn't contain her amusement. "Our personal shields could withstand that kind of attack for days." General Adams finally spoke, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. "Miss Nova, perhaps you'd be interested in a proper demonstration of Earth's military capabilities." Ambassador Lyra looked alarmed, but Nova's eyes lit up with interest. "A demonstration of these ancient weapons? Oh, that would be entertaining." The general's face remained neutral, but those who knew him well could see the glint in his eyes. "We would be happy to arrange it. With your mother's permission, of course." Ambassador Lyra hesitated, looking between her daughter's excited face and the general's controlled expression. After a moment, she nodded. "Perhaps it would be educational for all of us." As they entered the conference building, Nova was still smiling, completely unaware that she had just set in motion events that would change her view of humanity forever. Behind her, General Adams allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes the best lessons came from direct experience, and he had a feeling this young alien was about to learn one she wouldn't forget. 3 days after the initial meeting, a small convoy of military vehicles made its way through the Nevada desert. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape as dust clouds billowed behind the vehicles. Inside the lead Humvee, Nova pressed her face against the window, watching the empty desert with growing disappointment. "This is where you test your weapons, in this empty wasteland?" she asked, turning to General Adams, who sat opposite her. "Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one," he replied calmly. "Empty space means no civilian casualties." Ambassador Lyra sat quietly, watching the exchange between her daughter and the human general. She had tried to counsel Nova about showing more respect, but her daughter's confidence in their technological superiority remained unshaken. The convoy arrived at a makeshift command center, a series of reinforced containers set up on a ridge overlooking a wide valley. Several targets had been arranged at various distances: old tanks, concrete bunkers, and metal structures that glinted in the morning sun. "These will be your targets?" Nova asked, not bothering to hide her smirk. "Our personal shields could easily." "Yes," General Adams interrupted politely. "You've mentioned your shields. Would you care to demonstrate them?" Nova looked to her mother, who nodded approval. With a graceful motion, Nova activated her personal shield, a shimming bubble of energy that surrounded her body. "Our basic civilian model can withstand impacts equivalent to your most powerful non-nuclear explosives." The general nodded thoughtfully. "Would you be willing to stand behind one of our safety barriers while we demonstrate? Just as a precaution, of course." "I don't need your barriers," Nova declared proudly. "My shield will protect me." Ambassador Lyra stepped forward. "Nova, please, follow their safety protocols. We are guests here." Rolling her eyes, Nova moved behind the reinforced barrier with the other observers. A team of soldiers had been busy setting up various weapons on the ridge. The morning sun glinted off their polished metal surfaces. "We'll start small," General Adams announced. "Standard infantry weapons first." Nova leaned on the barrier, looking bored as the first soldier stepped up with an assault rifle. The sharp cracks of gunfire echoed across the valley, and metal targets pinged in the distance. "Primitive," Nova muttered. "Even our children's training weapons are more sophisticated." The general merely nodded and signaled for the next demonstration. A soldier shouldered a larger weapon, an anti-tank missile launcher. The projectile streaked across the valley and struck an old tank. The explosion was impressive, sending pieces of metal flying. Nova yawned theatrically. "Is this really the best you can do?" "Oh, we're just getting started," General Adams replied, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. He spoke into his radio. "Bring in the heavy artillery." The ground rumbled as several self-propelled howitzers moved into position. Nova's expression shifted slightly from boredom to curiosity. These weapons were larger than anything they'd shown so far. "You might want to put in your ear protection now," the general suggested, holding out a pair of advanced ear defenders. "My shield filters harmful sound waves," Nova replied dismissively, but she noticed her mother accepting a pair and reluctantly took them. The first artillery barrage made her jump despite her shield. The explosions in the valley below were far more impressive than she'd expected, sending shockwaves that she could feel through the ground. "That was louder than I anticipated," she admitted, trying to maintain her composure. General Adams smiled. "That's just the beginning. Would you like to see what happens when we coordinate multiple systems?" For the first time since arriving on Earth, Nova felt a tiny flicker of uncertainty. The gleam in the general's eyes suggested he was holding something back, something more impressive than what they'd shown so far. "Of course," she said, working to keep her voice steady. "Though I doubt it will be anything we haven't seen before." The general's smile widened slightly as he raised his radio again. "All units, prepare for Phase 2. Nova tried to maintain her air of superiority, but she couldn't help noticing that even her mother had leaned forward with interest. Perhaps these humans had more to show than she'd initially thought. The desert air grew thick with tension as General Adams directed the next phase of the demonstration. Multiple weapon systems moved into position, their mechanical whirs and clicks echoing across the valley. Nova tried to maintain her look of indifference, but her eyes kept darting between the various machines being prepared. "What you're about to see," General Adams explained, "is how we coordinate different weapons to overcome advanced defenses." He paused, looking directly at Nova. "Like your shields, for example." A series of distant booms drew their attention. Along the valley floor, smoke canisters activated, creating a thick blanket of artificial fog. Nova laughed softly. Smoke? Really? Our sensors can see through any. Her words cut off as the ground suddenly erupted in a series of synchronized explosions. The carefully timed detonations created a wall of fire and debris that reached toward the sky. That was just for show, the general said with a slight smile. The real demonstration begins now. Multiple weapon systems fired simultaneously. The combined sound was unlike anything Nova had experienced before, a deep physical force that she could feel in her chest despite her shield. Through the smoke, streaks of light crisscrossed the valley. Missiles, shells, and other projectiles created a deadly dance of destruction. The first target, an old tank, disappeared in a bloom of fire as 3 different weapon systems struck it at exactly the same moment. The combined force of the explosion sent its turret spinning high into the air. Interesting, Ambassador Lyra murmured, her diplomatic composure cracking slightly. Your targeting systems are more precise than we expected. Nova watched as a concrete bunker, reinforced with steel, was systematically taken apart. First, a specialized bunker buster bomb cracked its outer shell. Before the dust could settle, a barrage of smaller explosives found their way through the new gaps. The entire structure collapsed in on itself. That's not possible, Nova stammered. The timing required for such coordination would be impossible for human reflexes alone. General Adams finished for her. We combine human judgment with computer precision. Sometimes the old ways and the new work best together. The demonstration continued. Each new weapon system showed a different aspect of Earth's military capability. A new target appeared, a mock-up of what looked like an alien shield generator, though smaller than the ones Nova was familiar with. Now, pay close attention to this one, the general said. The attack began with what seemed like a standard missile barrage, but Nova noticed something odd. The explosions seemed weaker than before, but they created strange rippling patterns in the air. Resonance weapons, Ambassador Lyra breathed, genuine surprise in her voice. You've developed resonance weapons. Before Nova could ask what her mother meant, the mock shield generator erupted in a spectacular explosion. The blast was different from the others. Instead of raw force, it seemed to fold space itself for a split second. Even the strongest shield has a natural frequency, General Adams explained. Find that frequency, and well. He gestured at the smoking crater where the target had been. Nova's confident smirk had completely vanished. She watched with growing unease as the humans demonstrated weapon after weapon, each designed to overcome different types of advanced defenses. Many of them seemed simple at first glance, but their effects were undeniable. And this, the general said, is still just our conventional arsenal. We haven't even touched our more interesting capabilities. Nova swallowed hard. For the first time since arriving on Earth, she felt a creeping sensation that she might have severely underestimated these humans. Their weapons might look primitive, but their application of simple principles to create devastating effects was something she'd never considered. Perhaps, she said carefully, I should revise my earlier comments about human military technology. General Adams smiled. Oh, we're not done yet. In fact, we're just getting to the good part. Would you like to see what happens when we really cut loose? Nova glanced at her mother, who looked equally unsettled. Both aliens nodded slowly, their earlier confidence replaced by a growing respect. And just a touch of fear. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, the air shimmered with heat. General Adams spoke quietly into his radio, and the weapon systems on display changed. Larger, more intimidating machines rolled into position, their mere presence making Nova fidget behind the barrier. What you've seen so far, the general explained, represents our basic combat capabilities. Now we'll show you why even advanced civilizations might want to think twice about challenging Earth. A low rumble filled the air as massive artillery pieces, nearly 3 times the size of the previous ones, swung their barrels toward distant targets. Nova's eyes widened as she saw what looked like small buildings being towed into the target zone. Those structures, the general continued, are built to the same specifications as your standard military outposts. We studied the designs from your public database. Ambassador Lyra straightened, her diplomatic calm cracking slightly. You've been analyzing our defensive capabilities. Of course, General Adams replied simply. Just as you've been analyzing ours. The first shot made Nova gasp. The sound was unlike anything before. Not just loud, but physically powerful. The shell streaked across the valley, leaving a visible distortion in the air behind it. When it struck the mock alien outpost, the explosion wasn't just fire and smoke. It was a rippling wave of force that made the ground shake even at their distant observation post. Kinetic energy penetrators, the general explained. Simple concept. Very fast, very heavy projectiles. No fancy electronics to be jammed. No complex systems to fail. Before the dust could settle, more weapons opened fire. Cruise missiles screamed overhead, their paths seemingly random until they suddenly converged on a single target from multiple directions. The resulting explosion left nothing but a glowing crater. Your shields are impressive, General Adams noted, but they have to emit energy to work. Every emission can be detected. Every detection can be targeted. Nova watched in stunned silence as the humans demonstrated weapon after weapon. Many seemed almost crude in their simplicity, but their effects were devastating. A cluster bomb turned a hardened bunker into powder. A thermobaric weapon created a fireball that seemed to devour the air itself. But these are so wasteful, Nova finally protested. The energy efficiency is terrible compared to our weapons. The general nodded. True, but we don't need efficiency when we have abundance. Earth's resources might seem primitive, but there are a lot of them. A new target appeared in the valley. A full-scale replica of an alien light crawler, complete with shield generators. Nova felt a chill despite the desert heat. The humans had replicated their technology with disturbing accuracy. Watch carefully, General Adams said. This is something we developed specifically for dealing with energy shields. The attack began with what seemed like a normal artillery barrage, but Nova noticed something odd. Each explosion left a strange, shimmering residue in the air. As more shells landed, the residue grew thicker. Metamaterial dispersion, Ambassador Lyra whispered, genuine alarm in her voice. They've weaponized metamaterials. The shimmering cloud suddenly contracted, pulled into itself by some invisible force. When it touched the shield around the mock crawler, both the shield and the vehicle seemed to simply disappear. There was no explosion, no fire, just a quiet pop and an empty space where the target had been. Sometimes, the general said quietly, the most effective weapons aren't the ones that make the biggest bang. Nova stood in silence, her earlier arrogance completely gone. These humans had taken simple physical principles and turned them into weapons that could counter even the most advanced alien technology. Their primitive approach wasn't primitive at all. It was terrifyingly effective. General, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, you mentioned earlier that this wasn't everything you could show us. That's correct, he replied, checking his watch. In fact, we're about to move on to the next phase. I suggest everyone put on their protective gear now. What comes next? Well, let's just say it's a bit more impressive. Nova didn't argue this time. She quickly donned the protective suit offered to her, noting with growing unease that it was much heavier than what they'd worn before. The protective suits made everyone look identical, erasing the visible differences between humans and aliens. Nova stood rigidly in hers, watching as military personnel hurried to clear the area. The previous weapon systems were being moved far back, and the observation post was now sealed in what looked like additional layers of protection. What we're about to show you, General Adams said through the suit's communication system, is something we've only used twice in actual warfare. After that, just the threat of its use was enough to maintain peace. Nova noticed her mother's posture change. You're going to demonstrate a nuclear weapon? Ambassador Lyra asked, her voice tense. A tactical one, yes. Very small yield, specially designed for minimal fallout. The general pressed a button, and armored shutters began closing over the observation windows. The view will be through our filtered screens. The valley below had been cleared of all previous targets. A single point was marked with red flags, visible on their displays as a blinking dot. The air felt heavy with anticipation. 10 minutes to detonation, a voice announced over their communications. Nova tried to maintain her composure, but her heart was racing. She'd studied human nuclear weapons in theory, but no one in the Stellar Confederation had ever seen one used. They were considered too crude, too destructive, too primitive. 5 minutes. The weapon is being delivered by a hypersonic glide vehicle, General Adams explained. Another primitive technology that's surprisingly effective. 1 minute. Nova's hands gripped the railing in front of her. On the screens, she could see the glide vehicle approaching, a tiny dot moving at impossible speeds. 30 seconds. Ambassador Lyra reached over and took her daughter's hand. Even through the suits, Nova could feel her mother's tension. 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The first thing Nova noticed wasn't the flash. The screens automatically dampened it. It wasn't the sound either, though the boom that came seconds later made all previous explosions seem like whispers. What struck her was the way reality itself seemed to distort. A miniature sun bloomed in the valley. The fireball rose, pulling dust and debris into a perfect mushroom cloud. The shockwave raced outward, visible as a ring of compressed air that flattened everything in its path. Even through all the protection, Nova felt the power of it in her bones. By the stars, Ambassador Lyra whispered. The screen showed multiple views of the explosion. The thermal pulse alone had turned sand to glass. The pressure wave created a temporary crater in the Earth itself. And the radiation. Nova's suit sensors were screaming warnings even at this distance. This, General Adams said quietly, is what we call the equalizer. It doesn't care about shield harmonics. It doesn't need to penetrate defenses. It simply erases everything within its radius. As the mushroom cloud rose higher, Nova's mind raced. Their ship's shields were incredibly advanced, yes, but could they handle this level of raw power? The heat, the pressure, the radiation, all at once, all overwhelming. The yield of this device, the general continued, is approximately 0.3 kilotons. During our last World War, we used weapons thousands of times more powerful. We had tens of thousands of them. The implications hit Nova like a physical blow. Her people had dismissed human weapons as crude and inefficient, but watching the aftermath of this small nuclear device, she realized their mistake. Sometimes crude power was enough. Sometimes efficiency didn't matter if you could simply overwhelm any defense. She started, then had to swallow hard. I believe I owe humanity an apology. Through the suit's faceplate, she could see General Adams smile slightly. That's not necessary. Understanding is enough. This demonstration isn't about proving superiority. It's about ensuring mutual respect. Nova nodded, still watching the screens as the dust began to settle over the transformed landscape. She had come to Earth believing she would see amusing toys. Instead, she had witnessed the raw power that had shaped human history, and perhaps the future of interstellar relations. In the debriefing room, hours after the nuclear demonstration, Nova sat quietly as historical footage played on the large screen. The room was cool and dim, a stark contrast to the desert heat they'd left behind. Her mother, Ambassador Lyra, sat beside her as General Adams narrated Earth's military history. What you're seeing now is footage from World War II. He explained as black and white images showed massive fleets of aircraft dropping conventional bombs. Before we developed nuclear weapons, we already understood mass destruction. Nova watched, transfixed, as cities burned and armies clashed across continents. The scale was difficult to comprehend. But why? She finally asked. Why develop so many ways to destroy? The general pressed a button, and the screen showed a new image. Earth at night, lit up with countless cities. Because we learned the hard way that peace comes through strength. Every weapon we showed you today exists because, at some point, we needed it to survive. Ambassador Lyra leaned forward. Your species fought itself. With such weapons. We fought ourselves. We defended ourselves. We deterred ourselves, the general replied. Every weapon has a purpose beyond simple destruction. Sometimes, the purpose is to prevent war entirely. The presentation shifted to more recent conflicts. Nova watched as precision-guided missiles struck individual buildings, as cyber attacks disrupted enemy systems, as electronic warfare turned high-tech weapons useless. Your weapons, Nova said slowly, they're not really primitive at all, are they? They're evolved, tested. Exactly, the general nodded. We didn't develop energy weapons or force fields because we didn't need to. We perfected what worked. Kinetic energy, chemical reactions, nuclear forces, the basic physics of the universe applied with precision and purpose. New images appeared, classified footage of weapons they hadn't demonstrated, orbital platforms, electromagnetic pulse devices, weapons that could alter weather patterns or trigger earthquakes. We've developed more advanced technology than what we showed today, General Adams continued. But we keep the simple weapons because they work. Because they can't be hacked, can't be jammed, can't be turned off by some universal kill switch. Nova thought about her people's reliance on energy shields and complex electronic defenses. One well-placed electromagnetic pulse, one targeted virus, one simple kinetic strike, and those defenses could fail. Your civilization, Ambassador Lyra observed, has been shaped by warfare in a way ours hasn't. Not just warfare, the general corrected. Survival, innovation, the drive to protect what matters, no matter the cost. He paused the presentation on an image of Earth from space. We developed these weapons hoping we'd never need them, but we keep them ready, just in case. Nova stood and walked closer to the screen, studying her reflection overlaid on the image of Earth. I thought I was coming to see obsolete weapons today. Instead, I saw the reason your species survived to reach the stars. The most dangerous assumption in warfare, General Adams said quietly, is that your enemy thinks like you do. We don't have your technology, but we don't need it. We have our own path. The lights came up slowly. Nova turned to face the general, her earlier arrogance replaced by genuine respect. Thank you, she said, for showing us, for helping me understand. Understanding is what prevents wars, he replied. Now you know what we're capable of. And we know more about your defenses. Perhaps that knowledge will help both our peoples stay at peace. Ambassador Lyra stood as well. I believe my daughter has learned several valuable lessons today. About humanity, about assumptions, and about the nature of strength itself. Nova nodded, thinking about everything she'd seen. The raw power of nuclear weapons, yes, but also the clever application of simple principles, the layered defenses, the combination of old and new technologies. Earth's military wasn't primitive. It was practical, tested, and terrifyingly effective. I have one last question, she said. After seeing all this, how much haven't you shown us? General Adams smiled but didn't answer, and somehow, that silence was more powerful than any weapon they'd demonstrated that day. 1 week after the weapons demonstration, Nova stood at the window of the diplomatic quarters, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The past days had been filled with meetings, revised treaties, and a complete reassessment of human-alien relations. Are you ready? Ambassador Lyra asked, entering the room. The farewell ceremony begins in an hour. Nova turned from the window. Mother, did you know about their true capabilities? I had suspicions, Lyra admitted, but I didn't expect this. Our initial assessment of Earth was deeply flawed. A knock at the door interrupted them. General Adams entered, carrying a small wooden box. A parting gift, he said, placing it on the table. something to remember us by. Nova opened the box carefully. Inside lay a simple brass bullet casing, mounted on a wooden stand. The inscription read, "Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective." "I'll keep this on my desk," Nova said quietly, "to remind me never to judge by appearances." The farewell ceremony was held on the same field where their ship had first landed. But now, instead of mockery in her eyes, Nova looked at the assembled human military with newfound respect. Their primitive weapons were holstered at their sides, no longer a source of amusement, but a symbol of hard-earned wisdom. "The Stellar Confederation," Ambassador Lyra announced to the gathered dignitaries, "formally recognizes Earth as a Class A military power. We look forward to mutual defense agreements and technology exchange programs." General Adams stepped forward. "Earth accepts this recognition and offers its own hand in friendship. We have much to learn from each other." Nova watched the formal proceedings, remembering her first moments on Earth. How wrong she had been. How dangerous her assumptions could have been if Earth had been hostile. After the ceremonies, as their ship prepared for departure, Nova approached General Adams one last time. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked. "From the moment I laughed at your weapons, you knew exactly how this would play out." The general smiled. "Sometimes the best lesson is one you learn for yourself. Your people have amazing technology, Nova, but never forget that technology isn't everything." "I won't forget," she promised, "and I'll make sure others don't make the same mistake I did." As their ship rose into the atmosphere, Nova watched Earth grow smaller below them. The planet looked peaceful from space, its military power hidden beneath blue oceans and white clouds. A perfect camouflage, she thought, for a civilization that had mastered the art of survival. In her quarters, she placed the bullet casing on her desk, running her fingers over the inscription. Her computer showed incoming messages, other young aliens like herself, eager to hear about Earth's primitive weapons. She smiled, thinking of how to respond. "Computer, begin message," she said. "To all who asked about Earth's military capability, I have one piece of advice. Don't make the same mistake I did. They may not have energy weapons or force fields, but they don't need them. They have something far more valuable: experience, and they've learned their lessons well." Looking back at Earth one last time before their ship jumped to faster-than-light speed, Nova thought about everything she'd learned, about assumptions and arrogance, about the difference between advanced and effective, about the many faces of strength. The bullet casing caught the starlight, a simple piece of metal that had changed her entire worldview. She had come to Earth expecting to find a primitive civilization. Instead, she had found wisdom born from millennia of conflict and survival. As their ship disappeared into the depths of space, Nova knew that her report would change how the entire Stellar Confederation viewed humanity. They weren't primitive at all. They were survivors, innovators, and warriors who had learned their lessons in the harshest possible way. And sometimes, she now understood, that made them the most dangerous kind of civilization of all.